Okay, everybody. Hi, I'm Victor Glass, your host for today's webinar, Zen and the Art of Rate Design. This is another webinar produced by the Center for Research in Regulated Industries. For those of you who do not know our organization, CRI's mission is to promote research, scholarship, and education in regulatory economics aimed at improving public policy. Please visit our website for more information. The center has been in existence for more than 40 years. It was founded by Dr. Michael Crew, and I am the current director of the program. The main focus of CRI is on utility regulation, and that comprises the electric utility industry, water, gas, postal, and telecom. So the first question is, why the provocative name Zen and the Art of Rate Design? And the answer to some extent is that rate design ultimately is an art that improves with practice. And at some point, I know I have long experience as a rate developer, is that you get a sense of what a good rate design is, even if you can't really articulate it uh, very clearly, and it may have some logical limitations. This webinar is going to bring together experts who've struggled with rate design for many years, and we've asked them to articulate their wisdom. Now, for the panelists' information, and for everybody else, I was almost thinking of proposing another title to this webinar that focuses on a different perspective. I was thinking of proposing the Kabbalah of rate design. Now Kabbalah is pretty obscure. It's a tradition that suggests that there are many paths to a specific goal. There's no one right way of doing things. And in this tradition, there are symbolically 32 paths, which has a numerical value that in Hebrew means heart. So in other words, it's saying that in this tradition, it's saying that if you study and you have a good heart, then you'll probably pick a path towards a very worthy goal, but it may not be the same as everybody else. And each of these paths needs to be respected because the people who follow it have developed wisdom that's associated with their path. So this webinar, what we're trying to do is get the sense that try to figure out what people have learned and just intuitively know now. And the other point is that you'll see that there are different perspectives here. All of them have a legitimate and wise point of view that we should consider. So there are 4 categories of questions in this webinar, and they're pretty complicated. The first set of questions relates to cost. And all of these questions cross all network industries. And the first one is, what rate design is most efficient and practical, given that many costs can't be assigned directly to cost causers because there are a lot of joint and common costs. For example, you can think of feeder or transmission lines. The second set of questions are associated with demand and what rate design would meet the needs of customers with different tolerance for reliability and resilience. And should rates apply to specific product classes such as PVs, EVs, and heat pumps? And what if customers don't like it? What kind of alternatives are there? So that's the demand side. Then there's, of course, the huge issue of equity. So that's the third set of questions. What type of equity issues should the government address? Low income, with peak, off peak use, emergency needs. There are a whole host of questions about pricing and equity. And finally, there's a fourth set of questions that are associated with obligations. What are the obligations of a utility as a provider of last resort? And how does it change as the market changes? What business case is necessary for their survival as the market changes? And you still think you need a provider of last resort? Is a new public support policy necessary to meet the universal service obligations? So those are four sets of questions associated with demand, cost, equity, and obligation. And none of them are easy to answer. And there is probably not one path that's the right path. Today, we have a wonderful group and some returning, some new, moderator and panelists. Our moderator is Jeanne Fox, and our panelists are Cyndee Fang, Ahmad Faruqui, Bryan Hannegan, Mark LeBel, Paul Nelson, and Paul Zummo. And before I get into their bios, I just want to point out that the moderator and panelists are, once again, with those many paths, have very different perspectives on the market. Jeanne is, you'll see, is an experienced and regulator. Cyndee is from a large utility. Ahmad has been talking about rate setting, especially time of use, for quite some time as a consultant. Bryan Hannegan works for a cooperative. Mark LeBel basically represents consumer affairs here. Paul Nelson represents, in his own way, commercial industrial customers, and Paul Zummo represents municipals. So we're going to get very different perspectives here that I think are really critical for fleshing out and answering some of those questions, seeing what the issues are. Okay, so let me move this a little bit. Let me talk about, I'll read from here. Now I'll talk about the bios in detail, and you'll see that Jeanne Fox is an adjunct professor at Columbia and at Rutgers University. She served as a commissioner for the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities from January 2002 until September 2014. She was NJBPU's president and member of the government's governor's let me see, I have to move this. Cabinet.
Yeah, but I don't think you need to go through everything. If you have it up there, just go to the highlights for all of this.
Okay, well, basically, Jeanne is an outstanding regulator, has had many leadership positions in the industry and has been on so many advisory boards. And her key point, the key item that really sums it up is that she's a member of Rutgers Hall of Distinguished Alumni. Now that's a really rarefied group of people. So you can tell that we have an amazing moderator. Everybody else also has wonderful background. Cyndee Fang is from San Diego Gas and Electric, and she's an origination and portfolio design manager. Prior to that, Cyndee led the rate strategy efforts for SDG&E, which included residential rate reform efforts to transition residential customers from a multi-tiered rate structure to default time of use rates, and NEM reform efforts, net metering and the development of innovative rate designs, such as San Diego's hourly dynamic rate for its Power You Drive EV program. That's leading edge. Cyndee has a bachelor's from Berkeley and all but a thesis from University of Minnesota. And she's also served on CRI's Western Conference Organizing Committee, and I can tell you that she's articulate and extremely knowledgeable about rate issues. So welcome, Cyndee. Ahmad Faruqui is a returning panelist and sometimes moderator with is probably one of the best speakers we've ever had, Golden Tongue. He has 40 years of experience working on issues related to customer engagement, including rate design, load flexibility, distributed energy. He's done everything. He's worked with over 150 clients. He's published more than 100 papers. He's been cited by The Economist, Bloomberg Business Week, and Forbes, and he's appeared on NPR and Fox News. And everybody should have a pencil and paper ready in case he comes out with one of his aphorisms that are a gem. So I do that, and I have my pencil and paper ready. Okay, Bryan Hannegan, another one of our wonderful panelists. He's the president and CEO of Holy Cross Energy, a member-owned electric utility co-op that serves 46,000 customers in Western Colorado. So we're going to get that. And by the way, I used to work for a lot of rural utility company, telephone companies and co-ops. So I can understand his position. Prior to joining Holy Cross, Bryan was Associate Laboratory Director at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which he co-founded the U.S. Department of Energy Grid Modernization Initiative and started up the Energy Systems Integration. Early in his career, he had senior leadership roles at EPRI, and he worked for the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He's a former member of the California Council on Science and Technology, and you can see some of the other notable accomplishments there. He has a PhD in Earth Science, an MS in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and basically he has a wonderful background to represent the co-ops. Mark LeBel is going to be our consumer advocate. He has more than a decade of experience working on energy and environmental policy in the United States. During his time at Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP, Mark edited the recently released Electric Cost Allocation for a New Era, a manual that I've read from cover to cover, and was the co-author of the policy brief, Demand Changes, What Are They Good For? Before joining RAP, he was a staff attorney at Acadia Center and an appointed member of the Massachusetts Zero Emission Vehicle Commission. He has a bachelor's degree in applied mathematics and economics from Harvard and a law degree from NYU. Paul Nelson, another one of CRI's Western Organizing Committee members, and I know him for many years, and he's a wealth of information and always eager to help out. So a wonderful colleague. And he's currently a consultant at Barkovich and Yap. He does a lot of expert testimony, and he He's done a lot of work on rate making, demand response, resource adequacy, and reliability. And he provides expert services also to both the CPUC and the California Energy Commission. And prior to his current position, he was a senior regulatory advisor on marginal cost, cost effectiveness, and energy markets for Southern California Edison. I told you he's a member of CRI's organizing committee for the Western Conference. He has a bachelor's degree from USC and a master's from Claremont in economics. Paul Zummo is a director of policy research and analysis for regulatory affairs at the department at the American Public Power Association. He co-leads the association's Moving Public Power Forward initiative, which covers issues related to the utility of the future. Paul also oversees surveys related to salaries, performance indicators, and payments in lieu of taxes. He has a PhD in politics from Catholic University. And in this kind of environment, a degree in politics is probably extremely important. Not everything is solved by economic theory. So the format is that we're going to have a panel discussion moderated by Jeanne, followed by open discussion. Now, I don't need this because your microphones and video camera have been automatically turned off by the person who's managing this webinar. And please direct your comments, put them in the Q&A box, which Jeanne and I will look at, and during the panel discussion, we'll present them to the panelists. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jeanne.
Thank you, Victor. Hey, I'm really happy you're all here. We have about 250 online, over 300 signed up, and these are experts. The title Zen, I write, came from Ahmad, and I really got it because I think a lot of you know Zen and Chinese Buddhism stuff. It de-emphasizes knowledge alone. Now, all these experts have a lot of knowledge, but it's a direct understanding through interaction with accomplished teachers or masters. We have 6 masters here of the Zen of Right Design. These guys have been doing it their whole lives. They know what they're talking about. And there's not one answer to rate design. There's all kinds. And as I think everybody, I checked out the participants, a lot of people there who know this stuff. We all know what rate making is. If you go into Wikipedia, there's 5 pages about rate making, what it is. But we know that it's determining the revenue requirement, allocating that among customer classes, and then designing rate recovery. Well, different opinions on all this. And I think we have 6 different experts that have 6 different opinions, which are all legitimate. There's no right answer to that. So as we all know, the PUCs, and I was, in addition to being a commissioner and a president, I was actually a staff person in New Jersey BPU for 9 years in the 80s, a civil servant, and then did environmental and then came back to the BPU. But it's really safe, adequate, and proper service at reasonable rates. There's a lot in all those words, and that's what really goes in the rate design, and there's different answers to what your viewpoint is. So we do have a list of questions. What we're going to do is, and again, if you have a question in the audience that you want to ask when somebody is talking, write it right away in the Q&A. And Victor primarily will go over that at the end. The last 20 to 30 minutes at the end will be for your Q&As. So do that. Meanwhile, we're not going to go to you. But what we're going to do is I'm going to ask questions of the panelists. We're going to go in alphabetical order by their last name, which is the easiest one with those questions. But we will definitely get to some Q&As at the end. So start taking them in when you have it. You can do it now. So we're going to obviously start with Cyndee because her last name is Fang, and that comes before Faruq. So the first is on cost challenges of pricing. So what rate design is most efficient and practical, given that many network costs cannot be assigned directly to the cost causers because of the large joint and common costs? It's not just exact science. So what are the cost challenges there? And what's the most practical way? Cyndee?
Hello, everybody, and I'm so excited to be part of this panel and just want to do a quick sound check, make sure everybody's hearing me okay.
You're good.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, I'm going to leverage off of what both Victor and Jeanne said, is that when I look at what the most efficient rate design is, I don't think there is a one answer. Rate design, unfortunately, is a space where very rarely is there a one-size-fits-all solution to this. And so when I think about the various factors that you need to consider in developing a rate design, you begin with the cost drivers. And, in looking at those cost drivers, you need to make sure that you capture the drivers at every level of the utility system, which is highly complex. So, while peak load might be a main driver when looking at system level assets like generation and transmission, as you start moving down into the local distribution part of the system, those drivers, they look very different. And that ends up being, sort of the first consideration. And then next, you have the question of at what level of granularity are you looking to price? And so often that ends up being guided by operational constraints from utility to utility. And in addition to that, you need to think about, next you have to consider the transition issues, what I think about as transition issues. So, how do you get from the current rate design to this idea of an optimal? And how do you manage the bill impacts as you make that transition? Because that will be a key factor when you think about customer resistance and customer understanding. And as you consider those, this is where, the outreach and education is going to be critical to get that customer buy-in. And then finally, on top of that, you end up having to layer all of these policy requirements on in addition. So here you've got affordability concerns for your customers, as well as policy drivers that require utilities to consider the layer of incentives for preferred technology adoption. So whether it's advancing PV adoption, EV adoption, electrification, when you put all of these factors together, you end up with a situation where the most efficient and most practical rate design can actually be a very different answer as you look from utility to utility.
Thank you. Ahmad.
Thank you. So I personally think that rates should be cost reflective. And I have looked at the literature on the subject for many, many years. What's amazing is that last year's Nobel laureate, one of the two, Bob Wilson, wrote a book on public utility pricing called Nonlinear Pricing. Another Nobel laureate many years ago wrote a classic paper on controversies involving marginal costs, and that was Ron Coase, University of Chicago. Those two, along with Ralph Turvey, a very well-known name in marginal cost pricing, another British guy like Ron Coase, all of them have provided us the guiding principles for designing rates. It's called multi-part pricing. There are many people who are pushing for simple volumetric rates. Those are not cost reflective, and those will create economic inefficiencies and inequities. So the best form of rate to use as an anchor going forward is a rate that recognizes the fact that capacity and energy are two different services being provided by the grid to the customer. You cannot average the capacity into energy unless you use a load factor, and load factor varies by customer. So I am personally of the view that the best rate going forward is a multi-part rate, fixed charge, demand charge, and an energy charge. The energy charge can be time varying. It could be real-time pricing, or it could be time of use, or it could even be flat. And many people will say, well, no, it should only be time of use or real-time pricing. And I'm sure we will hear more commentary on that very, very shortly. I'm bracing for the after effects of whatever I'm saying here. But if you look at Georgia Power has probably the world's best real-time pricing program for C&I customers, some 2,200 customers. It has real-time pricing based on their system lambdas, but it also has a baseline load shape, and that baseline load shape is priced based on a fixed charge, a demand charge, and an energy charge. So they have, in many ways, they come the closest to what Ralph Turvey was talking about in his many books and articles. He said the ideal rate is a 6-part tariff. You have non-coincident demand, you have coincident demand, then you have time of use for energy, and then you have the fixed charge. So that's how Ralph came up with the 6 points. And again, this is something that Bob Wilson has supported. This is something that Ron Coase has supported. And more recently, Shmuel Oren of UC Berkeley and Hung Po Chow, who was with PJM until recently, they have a new paper coming out on subscription pricing. And so you have that concept as well. But subscription based on what? It is not your flat bill, which has been around for a long time. It is subscription based on demand. And it has been tested in the US by SCE many, many years ago. It's currently being offered in Holland and in many other places. So we have to be creative in how we price electricity. And I'm totally in agreement with Cyndee's point that no two customers are alike. Customers want choices. Some want subscription, some want a flat rate, some want a 3-part rate. So that's where we need to do some more market research. But deep down, the question is about cost causation. And I believe that's the basic bedrock principle of rate design. If you violate cost reflectivity, you're creating cross subsidies. If you create cross subsidies, they're unsustainable. One group of customers will subsidize another group of customers. So that's my opening salvo.
Thank you. We could all jump off on that, but we'll wait. Bryan.
Hi, everybody. Bryan Hannegan, President and CEO here at Holy Cross Energy, one of 900 rural electric cooperatives located throughout the country. And pleasure to be with you today amongst friends. I am but a humble pilgrim seeking wisdom and all that comes with that. We have the inimitable challenge of trying to translate academic research and think tankery around rate design into an actual practical outcome that provides us with enough revenue to keep the lights on, that does so in a way that helps keeps the rates affordable and provides for the integration of all of the emerging technologies and energy resources that are coming onto our primarily distribution system here about 2 hours west of Denver. Holy Cross Energy is unique in that we serve a territory that's very focused on distributed energy resources, on sustainable energy. In fact, just last month, we announced our commitment to go 100% carbon free for our power supply by the year 2030. That means no carbon, focus on wind and solar resources at the bulk power supply, but it also means on endowing our grid, our distribution system with the flexibility that it needs to accommodate both the variability in the supply and also the variability that comes with changes in demand from consumers that are increasingly generating on their rooftops at their homes or their businesses. They're plugging in electric vehicles. They're using electricity for other beneficial uses like heating and cooling and industrial processes. So as our business changes, so too must our business model, and so too must our rate design. And that is the challenge that's underway here at Holy Cross. We by no means think we have it right. I will also point out that it is a long process. As Ahmad said a moment ago, we have the classic volumetric rate design, a 2-part rate design for most of our customers that have demands below 50 kilowatts in peak capacity. We added demand charge for our residential and our general service customers that have larger peak demands on the system. And that's a 3-part rate with a demand charge. We have 2 sets of ski areas in our territory that have negotiated bespoke rate designs. Ironically, they're not the same between the 2 large ski areas, depending on how they were negotiated. One has 2-part and the other has 3-part. We've just recently expanded an optional time of use rate to help discourage consumption during our daily peak from 4 to 9 p.m., but it is optional, it's opt-in. And we've also implemented some new tariff, some rate programs that encourage a peak time rebate. So we pay our members to use less during the peak in the month when we're coincident with our regional power supply. We're also looking ahead to a world where we will have an oversupply of wind and solar resources. And so we run the peak time rebate in reverse. We call it our Green Up program. We actually pay our members to consume more rather than curtail the renewable energy. So increase their demand, charge their batteries, charge their vehicles. This Green Up program is a new feature that we'll be rolling out here in the next few months. And lastly, we're investing in buying capacity and resource adequacy from our members rather than from the market, because here in Colorado, we don't have a wholesale market to go to. We're not part of an RTO. We may be part of an energy imbalance market, although in Colorado, we're going that way in terms of Western or Eastern markets. And so we are relying more on buying capacity from our members through what we call a distribution flexibility program. For one monthly bill credit, we get the right as the utility to use the distributed energy resources behind the meter hosted by a member for grid services needs. We can use them to shave peak. We can use them to manage voltage. We can use them to bring extra resilience during times of disruption. So this distribution flexibility tariff is like a capacity payment to our consumers, and it's one of the more innovative parts of our emerging rate designs. Finally, I'll say we're big fans of rooftop and community-based solar and other clean energy generation as part of our resource mix. We foster that actively with a conscious cross-subsidy called net metering. It's required under state law, but unlike most utilities where we net meter at the retail rate up to some maximum, we don't dictate how big the system has to be or can be on the rooftop. We allow them to be built as big as possible, but beyond the first 20% of oversupply relative to the on-site consumption, anything after that, we pay for at our avoided cost rate. So rather than the full retail rate up to 120%, beyond that, if you want to build it bigger, great, but we'll pay for it just like we would be buying it in the market. The benefit for us as a co-op is we're buying it from our member owners rather than from somebody else. And so we're creating jobs, we're creating economic development in our community. All this is to say that with as much innovation as we've put in place, we're still highly dependent on volumetric sales. And in an area of the mountains where land costs are at a premium, where our native load growth is maybe 0% per year on a good year, and we're investing in energy efficiency, we're investing in distributed generation, we will have a day of reckoning at some point where we simply don't sell enough to maintain our system. And so for this paradigm of the future where we're a grid operator and we're not necessarily selling kilowatt hours, but we're selling services from the grid, the whole business model is something that needs to be rethought. And again, I'll just say I'm a humble pilgrim seeking wisdom from the mass here. And I'm looking forward to your thoughts on what the long-term rate design ought to be in a world where DERs are driving the future more so than the bulk power system. Thanks very much.
Right. Let me remind the audience that you should put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, because Vic has got to go through that. So if you put questions in the chat, please turn them around and put them in the Q&A. So Victor only has to look at the Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, now we're going. I'm sorry, I like all you guys. You're like my favorite people, but the Regulatory Assistance Project are like my Goombas, right? So Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Jeanne. So I'm going to start off with a couple principles that are worth mentioning. That you want to think about a blend of lots of different considerations when you're doing rate structure, cost allocation, and rate design. You want to talk about efficient forward-looking price signals. That's the marginal cost principle. Recovery of the revenue requirement, equitable intra-class cost allocation, customer understanding and bill management, and achievement of public policy goals. Good answers blend all of those results. And you have to look at all of them at the same time. It's like a Rubik's Cube. You got to try to look at all sides, and you can't just look at the yellow side and then all of a sudden you look at all the other sides and they're all scrambled still. So you got to keep a lot of things in mind. So I'm a lawyer, but I have a background in math and economics. So I'm going to offer an algorithm, actually. Step one is use short-run marginal cost pricing where you can. Often that has to be differentiated by customer sophistication. For small customers, you can use time of use with peak time rebates or critical peak pricing. For larger customers, you can use real-time pricing. Step 2, then you layer in long-run marginal costs. That can be the cost of connection and billing. That's a modest customer charge. Shared system costs can be done on a time-varying basis. The key thing to know, and this is the dispute between Dr. Faruqui and some others of us, which I'm happy to get into, is that it's not the individual customer maximums that matter. It's the times of system stress. And I think the term demand charge is a misnomer, and actually we need to move past the term demand. Individual maximum charges are very bad in many cases at reflecting the times of shared system stress. Transformers and the service drop, there's a number of different options. You can have a tiered customer charge based on the size of a panel. You can have a KVA subscription like Electricité de France, or you could have a traditional demand charge that reflects transformer sizing, but that's probably only $1 or $2 a kilowatt. Step 3, if you have any residual costs that still need to be recovered, you can look at whether you've underpriced externalities, and you could talk about Ramsey pricing versus the demands of competition and some broader political economy concerns about how you want to control utility costs. And I think it's important to note that flat volumetric rates are not the future, and particularly when you have high penetrations of distributed generation, we're going to need a different model. Bidirectional marginal cost pricing based on time works for shared system costs, but you might need something else. For the distribution network backbone and A&G costs at high levels of penetration for distributed generation, you might want to start pricing on flows instead of deliveries or sales. Every single utility executive talks about deliveries, sales, like, well, that might not be what it is anymore. Flows is another model entirely. And I guess I'll say, RAP put out a paper on demand charges a couple months ago. I'm looking for Dr. Faruqi's full written response. But the terminology, demand, it's honestly more confusing than it is illuminating at this point. Supply and demand is very colloquial. People use that all the time. And then the category demand related has so many ambiguities built into it. Historically, it meant peak related, actually, which I think is much more clarifying. But then also peak related, capacity related, reliability related, and demand related are 4 different things. And too many times when people say demand related, they're talking about some subset of these. And it's important to actually separate them out. We can do that. We have the modern analytical tools. Capacity is not all demand related, is the key thing to know. To meet peak capacity, peak demand, you can build a combustion turbine or you can build a nuclear plant. Those are very different technologies that serve very different needs, and you should have to recognize that in both cost allocation and rate design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, now we're going to get to the 2 Pauls. Paul Nelson first.
Yes, this is Paul. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I need to start off by saying that I'm speaking today on behalf as an individual and not a representative of Barkovich and Yap or any of my clients. All comments are my personal opinions based on my experience in education. I kind of want to start off with the phrase of art of rate design. I mean, it's somebody who's done marginal cost and rate design work for a long time. I've got a set of principles, marginal cost-based principles that I follow. So that part to me is less of an art. I believe the art of rate design occurs at the commission level. And I think also there's a little bit at the utility level when you're trying to compete with various policies that are competing against each other. And then that's where the art comes in. And then also when you have restrictions on the rate design, the typical, volumetric only, while the background may have calculated demand costs and all these other cost driver components, it all gets collapsed into energy rates. So that's, I think, where some of the art comes in. So kind of hearing what I've heard before, and I don't want to repeat a lot of what Ahmad Faruqui said, but I kind of want to put in context of getting back to efficient and rate design when you have a lot of fixed cost and network cost. And that sort of then goes back to, what was the idea concept of the marginal cost bit rate design that sort of diverged in the 1980s, is trying to get as close as possible to what are the cost of rate design and the marginal cost. And I think that goes into what I believe what the 6 parts rates of, looking at what's energy related, what's peak demand related, what's non-coincident demand related, what's customer related, and I'm not sure if I read off the 6. There may be another one. Is trying to track those as best as possible, and then you could then scale up those so that you get the revenue requirement, the use of the EPM scalar, equal percentage of marginal cost. And why is this still important today? I mean, it was developed back in the 1980s because there was a great concern from industrial customers leaving the system because combustion turbines were coming cheaper. And the impact of that, what they called then uneconomic bypass, was then the cost had to get recovered from the remaining customers, which drove up rates. This is even more important today than it was back in 1980, because the ability for uneconomic bypass is not just industrial customers. It's pretty much all the end customer customers who can afford to bypass. So bad rate design needs to get resolved. And so I've read some of the stuff from the my prior speaker from the regulatory assistance projects and on demand charges, and I definitely disagree with that. Demand definitely has a role to play in understanding the cost drivers and charging the right cost. I mean, while time of use rates may tell you when to use the grid, it doesn't necessarily result in how you use the grid. And I think this is going to become much more critical with the push to electrify both the transportation sector and the heating sector. And I don't want to beat up on electric vehicles, but we're going to have facing choice in the transportation sector. What signal do we want to send people on when they have 2 electric vehicles and charging? Are they going to do it at the same time, or should they do it sequentially? And I think in terms of maybe I'm jumping ahead in terms of some equity issues. Should a customer that wants to charge their vehicle at the same time as their neighbor who decides to do not at the same time but use the exact same amount of energy, should they pay more or less? Or a slightly different example is, I want to fast charge. I want to charge my vehicle in 2 hours because I want to go someplace. Should that person pay more than somebody who else is going to wait a while?
Right.
So I think I'll close at that.
That's good. It's going to be for good discussion, Paul. Thank you. And last but not least, or Z, Paul Zummo.
Thank you. So I was listening to a podcast last week, and they were talking about Jon Favreau and why he was able to kind of revive the Star Wars universe and what are his skills as a director. And they said that he starts with the premise of, where am I going? What is the end goal? What is the end state? So naturally, I thought about rate design in that context. And I think that's the question we have to ask. What is the purpose of rate design? Why are we implementing this rate? I think recovering costs and ensuring reliability, and I think they're connected, those 2 concepts are connected, are probably foremost. But then there are other considerations like environmental conservation and shifting peak and getting customers to charge at specific times. And some of that is cost related, especially if you're a wholesale dependent utility, and some of those are environmental. And then there's issues of equity and fairness. And so I know we're talking about Zen and the art of rate design, and I know my background, as Victor mentioned, is in politics, but we don't want to get too Socratic here, I guess, and think about first principles. But we do, to a certain extent, we have to, at least when we're thinking about rate design. I have 2,000 members. I have 1,950 retail members of different sizes, and I think they would come to different conclusions on some of these questions. They would have different answers and different rate designs. So again, like everyone else, I think has pretty much said, there's no one rate design, especially for a group of utilities like that. So to me, the right rate design is the rate design that best answers those questions for each system. And then secondly, I would also say that it's one that doesn't punish, for lack of a better term, one subset of customers at the expense of another. Look, there's 241 participants. You probably get 240 different definitions of fixed and variable costs. I recognize that. Some of our members would say that 70% of their costs are basically fixed. Others would rap me on the knuckles if I said it was that high. But this is not an academic question. So I think when we're, especially in a world of more distributed resources, we'll talk about value solar. I think that it's more appropriate for the next set of questions. But I think that there are rate designs that are better able to respond to these different costs allocations. I know some of our members have implemented grid access charges. So that's what some people call a poor man's demand charge. You have a higher fixed cost, you have a higher customer charge based on your historic use over the past year. So your charge might be $10 if you use 500 top peak was 500 kilowatt hours, but if your peak was 1,500, your access charge would be $20. Several of our members have implemented time of use rates, default time of use rates. Now, Fort Collins, SMUD, Fayetteville, Tullahoma have implemented default. And customers can adapt to these rate design changes. I think that's, and then leave it with this, and this is not necessarily a rate design concept, but transparency. I think whatever we do, I think the rates need to be transparent. I think customers should be able to figure it out. They should have access to it. If we have dynamic pricing, we should have access to it on the web, through apps, maybe even on in-home displays. And it should be, let's not make it too complicated for our customers either. As I said, customers can adapt. I think we've shown that through pilots and through these default time of use rates. But at the same time, they shouldn't have to read directions before they figure out what the rates are exactly. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Mark, you want to make a comment?
Yeah. Do I have a moment to respond to
Sure you do.
Paul very
Now,
briefly?
Yeah, each of you have a comment. I think Mark and Ahmad might want to have a little discussion.
Well, I mean, look, we don't want this to be 2 hours just talking about demand charges.
No.
But I think it's worth honing in on his example. That if you have two big EVs that you want to charge simultaneously, it depends whether elements of the system are stressed as to whether they're imposing marginal costs. If there is slack generation capacity, transmission capacity, substation capacity, knock yourself out. The question that we talk about in the demand charge paper is, for a big customer, a big residential customer on a line transformer, maybe a demand charge is appropriate there, but maybe not even. If that transformer is cold and there's sufficient capacity to charge both your EVs, the marginal costs are still low. So demand charges can be a proxy for certain system stresses, but it's the sophisticated time-based marginal cost pricing for a transformer would actually be based on the temperature of the heating oil in the transformer. Michael Karamanis and other people at BU wrote a paper about this. There's very detailed, very good marginal cost work out there on this, and I think the strengths and weaknesses of the case for demand charges, rise and fall on certain things like this, and I think it's important to be precise if we're gonna debate it.
Ahmad, anybody else? Not?
I'll just add,
Brian.
one of the things that we're exploring here at Holy Cross is a implementation of some dynamic pricing on the energy charge. And Mark's comments remind me of some work that we conducted when I was still at NREL, looking at the response of distributed energy resources to different dynamic pricing. And we did this on a set of 20 electric vehicles located in our employee garage. And we gave them a day ahead price signal that was designed to avoid the campus peak and all that. And like clockwork, as soon as the price signal dropped, all the vehicles charged back on. And all we did was shift the peak demand from this point over to that point. And so we started thinking about, how do you do differential price signals that are locationally and spatially variable? And I think I'm a big believer of that, even to the point of perhaps sending an individual price signal to the meter. My question for the group is kind of what is the grand unified theory of meter level pricing, right? We've talked about DLMPs at the distribution node, kind of the equivalent of what we see on the wholesale market side. Is there a model out there where distribution utilities like mine become little mini DSOs, distribution system operators, and we're operating a grid and sending price signals to each individual consumer meter? And if so, where is the work that tells us how to, develop the pricing structure that will get us what we need?
That very
there's-
question, when I was on the EPRI advisory group, and I think you were at EPRI then, that was a question that we discussed as a group, and this was over 10 years ago.
That's right. And we still haven't figured it out, Jeanne. So
Okay, so let me interject a couple of comments. Michael Karaminas, I'm probably mispronouncing the last name, at Boston University, right? He had a conference 2 Novembers ago on distribution level locational real-time pricing. And he's been writing on that for 40 years, right? So he knows a lot about the subject, but the implementation is zilch. And there is no way you're going to see that in our lifetime. I mean, what you're talking about is a political impossibility. That's my opinion. Obviously, it's not based on anything other than anecdotal evidence, but trying to have prices that vary across neighborhoods is a dream. Now, in terms of demand charges.
Because why?
Say that again?
Why is it a dream?
It's a dream because we don't even have time of use rates in the US today. We have less than 6% of the customers on simple vanilla time of use rates. We talk about dynamic pricing and locational dynamic pricing, and we fantasize endlessly, and we convince ourselves that this is reality, but it is a dream.
Okay, Paul?
I think on the locational issue, this comes to me over at the regular layer, brings up huge equity issues when you start trying to geographically distinguish pricing across the service territory. Well, one, there's the cost of doing that, and was actually looked at by the utilities and the CAISO. They actually looked at trying to disaggregate, because right now they load purchases power at a weighted average, and the FERC said no, look down at actually pricing load down at a P node, and it was enormously expensive to look at the cost versus benefits. But then there's also the equity issue comes into play as well.
Right.
And if I can make just one quick comment, I know we are short on time, but Paul and I were at a conference with the California Commission back in December 17, and the issue was demand charges. Should they be eliminated for C&I customers? It was not residential customers, it was C&I customers. Right. It was a 1.5 day long session. Severin Borenstein was the opening speaker, and he said what you would expect him to say. And then there were all the other panels. And I can tell you at the end of the session on the second day, a senior staff member from the PUC came to me, and he has a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. He said, I was supportive of what Severin was saying, but it looks like 90% of the people in the room, including the large industrial customers, including the large commercial customers, including also the utilities, and including you, Mr. Faruqui, you are all saying that what we have today is a cost-reflective way to do business. And in the meantime, the president of the commission had been listening to some of the debates that I was having with Severin. He was not in the room. At some point, he came by. During a break, I ran into him. He said, I was listening to your debate. And he said it was a smackdown. I don't know which way it went, but it was a smackdown. I have recorded that. I'm going to put it on YouTube, and I'll make some money off the hits that it'll get. It is an unresolvable issue. It's an ideological issue. And that's why I try not to rebut every point being made, by Mark or other people. You either like it or you don't, and it's your choice. It's just part
of the Zen part. Cynthia, Cyndee.
Yes, if I can add to the locational discussion. And before I do, thank you, Paul, for the reminder. My comments represent my personal views and opinions and should not be taken to represent the position of SDG&E or Sempra Energy. So sorry about that. One thing is I did want to point out that San Diego Gas and Electric, for their Power Your Drive program, the hourly dynamic rate that we have in place for that program actually does allow for locational It has a circuit level dynamic pricing component. And so regarding the equity issues that surround locational pricing, the way we addressed it there is that for each circuit, we identified it's sort of the top 200 hours at each circuit. So each circuit gets hourly CPP events, but they occur at different times depending on the load at the circuit level. So
what is CPP for everybody on?
Oh, I'm sorry, critical peak pricing. So this is the dynamic rate. It followed the similar model that I think you see more commonly looking at generation or commodity pricing, but here we applied it at the distribution level, at the circuit level.
Okay. I want to now move on to the next question. Does anybody have anything they feel like they have to say right now based on the past discussion? Okay. Well, we're going to go back to alphabetical order, but we'll start at the bottom and work up. So we'll talk with Paul Zummo. This is a three-part question as what different customer needs and what does that mean? The first question is, what rate design would meet the needs of customers with differing tolerance of reliability and resistance? I.e., me as a residential person who doesn't need electricity 24/7 every year or so, and somebody who's a data center and they need it 24/7 all the time. So starting with Paul Zummo.
So we're going to ask if people are accepting 99% reliability as opposed to 99.9% reliability, although maybe that actually is the question. I think we already sort of do that. If you look at if you go on most, especially larger utility websites and look at their tariffs, it's not like you have one residential tariff. You have multiple residential tariffs for this, and especially in the commercial, but even on the residential, you see different levels already. But that's different maybe than the question we're asking here, because in that sense, the rate is choosing the customer, because it's based on profile versus a customer choosing the rate, which is what I think we're talking about with subscription rates. For utilities that customers have a certain level of tolerance. But I think that's also, I think we've already started slowly down that road, but I think I have the same concern about that I would with pilot time of use rates, and I might be stealing Ahmad's thunder here. When you have a pilot time of use rate, an opt-in rate, well, customers get to choose the rate that's best for them. Well, enough customers do that. Eventually, you're going to have a shortfall for the utilities. Sorry, Ahmad. So I think it's, and again, I know it's different with subscription rates than opt-in time of use rates or what has been proposed, but I think it's the same basic concern is that you're going to have customers who can sort of take as much as they want, but then we're getting back to the first question of, are we able to recover the costs? Because there's still costs, no matter how much power they take or what sort of level of, we as the utility, and I'm not a utility, I represent utilities, utilities still have to aim for 100% or 99.99% reliability. So even if there are customers who can accept certain lower thresholds, that doesn't matter to the utility. At the end of the day, they still have to try to serve everyone all the time as much as possible. So we're back to covering the costs. So, you know, again, there's not going to be one, I don't think there's one specific rate design that can meet that. I think it's just, it's developing the rate that can capture and recover your costs so that you can maintain reliability. Again, you can't maintain reliability if you're broke. So.
Okay, Paul Nelson. What rate does that meet the needs of customers with different tolerance?
Yeah, sorry, it took me a little while to unmute myself. I had to remind to unmute myself there. So I kind of struggle with this question because in an interconnected grid, in one perspective, I don't know how a utility could offer different reliability or resilience to two customers that were, say, next to each other. I struggle with that one a little bit. But there is one aspect I think that is done is using demand response programs to take into consideration that there is different valuation of service. Mm-hmm. So a demand response program will typically offer a discount or incentive generally during the types of scarcity, or even down at the local level, if there's a T&D problem, some utilities programs can then utilize the demand response. And so then allows the customer with a lower value of service to basically drop their load. So a customer with a higher value of service, or the default, can continue to receive service.
That's true. Okay, that's good. Good point. Mark?
Yeah, I don't have anything groundbreaking here. There are some cases where people want a second transformer in case one blows out, or you want to get a connection from the other circuit on the other. If you're a really big customer, you want to have basically be networked so that if one circuit fails, you're also on the other circuit or something. But and you should pay appropriately for that based on your cost of connection. There are some places where this could go that people are going to do things themselves. They're going to buy their own storage now to have better reliability when the grid goes down. There are some troubling haves and have-nots aspects to that, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bryan?
Yeah, I want to thank Mark for bringing up the equity issue, because that's something that we're struggling with a little bit. We have a service territory that's got some super rich and some super not so rich. What we're finding is there's a lot of interest in behind the meter storage and oversizing PV and doing all sorts of things for those who can afford it. But for those who can't afford it, they really rely on our backbone grid and frankly on our basic rate design in order to provide them with the reliability that they're seeking. We have started developing a behind the meter program called Power Plus for our members that want to adopt energy storage. We're trying to have visibility into the energy storage resources that come onto our grid. So while any member can connect a battery at their home with any vendor that they choose, they can also choose to work with us directly to receive a battery to their home or to their business using our balance sheet, low financing, no money down, on-bill financing, all of the bill credits and programs I talked about early, wrapped into one low monthly fee, a la the Green Mountain Power program.
Right.
And we've got a waiting list that's, long for this sort of thing. We're also working with several of our communities where the topology of our system lends itself to concerns over resilience, especially with the wildfires that we've seen in Colorado and the West this year. We're now working with those communities to develop some community storage and/or community microgrid options that provide them with a plan B. But as Mark points out, those are extra investments. And I think the question of whether they should be socialized across the entire membership raises equity issues of its own. Our preference so far is to, if somebody wants more resilience, then they can find a way to pay for it. And they do.
I mean, that makes sense. Are any utilities, public utilities, privately owned utilities doing that same type of thing?
Yeah, in fact, Xcel Energy has made a filing here in Colorado with the PUC to do a number of energy resilience and microgrid projects, and they've proposed to rate base those. That docket is before the PUC, and we'll see where it turns out.
That's the rate base for all customers to pay for, not for that individual customer who wants the more reliable system.
No, we typically, our line extension policies, which we've extended to all forms of DERs as well, allows for the participant to pay to connect if it's a bespoke thing. I think the larger question is on a community microgrid that includes the water and sanitation, the town hall, the school, the airport, right? How do you pass the hat in such a way where you get the participants, plural, to pay for it? We've had the similar with a neighborhood or a homeowners association that comes to us and says, we want to invest in X. And I think an agile utility will take that not as a, we've never done that, don't bring that stuff here, but we'll actually sit down with them and figure out how to make it work.
Thank you. Ahmad.
So for large customers, this has been around for a number of years. Some customers want highly reliable power. They pay more for that, right? That has been commonly practiced for the last 50 years. For residential customers, it's a new issue. Let me make 3 comments. One, in Saudi Arabia, I did a lot of work over the years in that region, and I discovered that the palaces had extra reliability power. The palaces would never lose power. Somebody might lose their head. So that's when I discovered it was possible to differentiate reliability for residential customers. Think about it this way. If a new customer, whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial, moves into an area that's remote from the grid, there's a lot of incremental cost to connect them. And the question is, should that be socialized, or should that be all given to that one customer? A utility in New Zealand asked me that question. I did a survey of utilities in the US. I found half of them do it one way, the other half do it the other way. So it's all a question of jurisdictions, politics, and what have you. Coming to the more recent issue with wildfires, which certainly California has been a big part of the challenge, I'm seeing more and more people put battery storage. And some of them are pairing it with solar, but some of them have the battery just in reserve for the wildfires. They are paying for the battery themselves. Okay? There is no socialization of that happening. There is a $2,000 rebate that you can get through the state self-generation incentive program. But otherwise, it's a pretty big hit, right? It's a $10,000 to $14,000 investment. The question has arisen whether the utilities should somehow allow for that in areas that are more prone to wildfires, and that's what Bryan was mentioning. I think, as far as I know, that's still subject to some debate as to who should pay for that.
I mean, the question is, if they do it in areas for subject to wildfire, they could do the financing for that customer through the utility bill, right?
So there are innovative ways you can do it, but the question is, ultimately, do you spread the cost over all customers or just over those 100 customers in that area?
And my personal feeling is, over the 100 customers in that area, to decide to live in wildfire country. But that's a debate question, and obviously.
Yeah, it sort of, that might be, Jeanne, your personal opinion, and there will be 10 other personal opinions on the opposite side, as you know.
Right. Yeah, for the people who want something and what other people pay for it.
Exactly, yeah. And I think what you have in a lot of this rate design discussion is, it is inseparable from political considerations.
Oh, definitely.
How much weight do they have? I was at a meeting of the board of directors of an unnamed municipal utility. The issue was net metering. And one of the board members started the conversation by saying, I have solar on my roof, and I put it not just to save money, but to help the planet. So I want you 4 speakers to keep that in mind as you talk about the cost shift issue. I thought to myself, she should recuse herself. She already has her mind made up. She's not looking for evidence. She's looking for a round of applause.
Yes, and that's why I didn't put solar in my houses until after I left the commission.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cyndee.
You know,
This question.
when I think about the tolerance for reliability and resilience, it makes me go back to my economic background. And I think we need to be able to find a way to draw the line between the electricity that's needed as an essential good, so for essential use, versus where it starts to cross the line into that luxury good. So especially, you know, as Bryan was talking about, it plays such a critical role in affordability and equity when we look at our customers. And I think that with it's become even more critical in the current COVID pandemic situation. And the other thing that we saw with that is, you know, if you think about the electricity needs that for essential use, you know, that line changed dramatically when we look at our residential customers. So as we think about potential options there, we're going to have to be able to find a way to differentiate that and be able to have the flexibility for that line to adjust when a customer's essential needs can change. And like I said, can change dramatically from what we've recently seen.
Okay. Now, the same topic generally, but a little bit more specific. And we got into it a little bit. Should rates apply to specific product classes like EVs, photovoltaics, heat pumps? And that's it. I mean, we got into that a little bit, but what do you think? Let's start in the middle. Let's start with Hannegan, work down, work up. Bryan.
Thanks, Jeanne. You know, we've considered that and so far avoided separate rates for different kinds of DERs. We're still treating a kilowatt hour as a kilowatt hour, regardless of whether it's consumed or generated. I do think that there's an interesting conflict between desires for high energy rates to encourage energy efficiency and low energy rates to encourage beneficial electrification. It's not something I think anybody's really solved yet. I will just point that out, that you want to try to encourage both efficiency of existing use and expansion of new uses of electricity that are beneficial. And a volumetric rate may be a very poor tool with which to do that.
Yeah. Bark. Different rates for specific product classes?
Did you say Mark?
Yes, Mark.
Okay, sorry. So I'll pick up on what Bryan said. I think there's less of a contradiction there than people think, that if you have time varying rates, then at sometimes the prices are low and at sometimes the prices are high. So if electrification can happen and you can use your appliances when the prices are low, then all of that works out a little better than perhaps was implied there. So I do agree with Bryan that technology specific rate classes or rates are not necessarily a good idea. That's not how costs are necessarily incurred. It's more based on time patterns. Sometimes certain technologies like heating are a proxy for patterns of usage. So there can be a link. I do think the better path forward, though, is having technology neutral rates and improving their cost causation basis. I think that one way of doing that going forward that I've thought about to try to meet various equity and efficiency goals is to segment the residential class into a simple or basic class and then an advanced class. And then the simple class could have a peak time rebate. Maybe it even sells a flat rate. Maybe it's TRU in the next few years. So low income and low usage people can be on the simpler rate that's easier to understand. And one feature of the distinction could be that if you're going to net meter, if you're going to have distributed generation, you can't be on the simple rate. You have to be on the complicated one. So that's a sort of a transition mechanism. And then the more complex residential rate class can have, whatever we want to roll out next would go to the advanced side of the residential rate class. That's bigger customers, people with EVs, people with distributed generation. There's a few different heuristics you could try to use to segment residential customers to try to meet both our concerns about customer understanding, keeping things simple and easy for customers who want that, and then having more granular cost reflective rates for customers who are more sophisticated.
Okay, Paul Nelson. Different product classes rates.
As a general principle, I would be against different rates for different products. I mean, my clients would be upset if one industry was preferred over another in rate design. And so I think as a general principle, if you've got cost-based rates, they apply to everyone equally. However, obviously, I think in a lot of the residential rate classes, you get into the problem when this is where the art comes in of customer understandability. I mean, if I was going to present an industrial rate design to a residential customer, it'd probably be overwhelming. But there's some that there's some mansions that may like it. And kind of going back to the issue I see as a pending issue, it's a big one, is electric vehicles. And we don't, one idea would be don't call it a demand charge, but hey, when you sign up, would you like to charge your vehicles, at the same time or not? And there might be a slight surcharge for that. And that gives then an indication to the utility that, hey, there's a customer out there that's going to have perhaps a higher peak demand than perhaps their neighbors, and they can plan that in their distribution system and make their investments accordingly. And it again gives a customer's choice over what they want to do, which then will ultimately drive the, what's the investment impact on that. So
yeah, I mean, we're thinking about CRI is thinking about having a separate session panel specifically this spring on EVs. Because it's really because they use so much electricity, and obviously you really don't want them on peak charging. That's because that's a hot topic, and it's everywhere now.
Yeah. I think this is a hot button but I think there's a lot of economists out there who see how NEM was done to encourage solar PV, and the distortions they created was a big mistake. And it's now become sort of an accepted norm, and a lot of states have required it. And jumping forward to equity issues, maybe save my experience and view on that later. But there's a caution in there to sort of developing a rate specific, especially if it's designed to promote a specific class.
Yeah, and we'll be
Or
getting
type.
that very soon. Paul Zummo.
Yeah, it sort of gets to the very first thing I said. What are we trying to accomplish with rate design? Are we trying to promote certain activity? On the fundamental question of do we have different rates for different products themselves, I guess the answer is have a different response there than previous panelists. But we already have rates around solar, we have rates around EVs, and I think those are appropriate. I think getting back again to cost causation, we're trying to adequately get to the full benefits and the costs associated with someone who puts solar panels on their roof. I think a true value of solar rate. When I say a true value of solar, I think again, if we put out 50 different studies on value of solar, you come up with 50 different answers for the same utility, 50 different people looking at it. But if we were trying to do a true cost and benefit reflective study of solar, put a tariff that adequately reflected that, I think that would be a good first step. And then again, with EVs and other electrification, other products and other BERs, this gets into more of a political, maybe the next couple of questions about what's the role of government and what's the role of social equity and things like that.
Yeah, but we'll get them pretty soon. So Ahmad and then Cyndee, the specific any response or should rates apply to specific product classes?
No, I personally don't think that we can afford to have an algorithm where we have rates for individual technologies. I understand society might want to promote specific technologies for all kinds of good reasons. The best way to do that is through either a tax code or through a DSM program.
Right.
So do not mess with rates to favor technologies. Otherwise, every new year, there will be a new technology coming on and everybody would want a discount or a credit for that technology. And how it'll have unintended consequences. We have seen that with NEM. We're going to see that with any other new technology that comes along. So I'll keep my response short.
Thank you. Cyndee. Different rates for
I
different
think
products.
I think there's a couple of different things that when I think about technology specific, one of the challenges that creates is that, we see already today that our customers are not one technology customers, they're combined technology. So our EV customers are also our solar customers, our storage customers are also our solar customers. And so the doing technology specific rate design or customer classes it's just not really feasible. And I think it's a different problem depending on if you're doing a customer or technology specific rate versus a technology specific customer class. Because it's important to remember that as we look at this, if you create an opportunity or a benefit for one customer group, what it means is you're resulting in another group having to pick up those costs. And I don't want to use the word cost shift because it's hard to know which way the dollars are moving without a specific context. But, it's important to remember that any of those changes, it's going to result in winners and losers. And with that, then it's really important to understand. So in defining that new rate or defining that new class, what is the driver? Is it a policy driver, to create incentives, or is it actually a cost-based driver? And then either way, even if it's a movement towards more cost-based rates, you still run into those transition problems because the rate they move off of, if it's not cost-based, you're still going to run into problems. And one thing to add too is that I just lost my train of thought. but the whole idea of how you make those transitions, it's going to be different too if you're thinking about rates, if it's an optional rate versus a requirement, right? If you have that technology, do you have to be on that rate, or do you have the option of moving back and forth,
Right.
which then creates gaming opportunities?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to the equity issue. So what type of equity issues should government address regarding rates, especially low income, but also going to toss in the on-off peak usage, as well as maybe emergency needs, but specifically for low income and then on and off peak, what type of equity issues should the utility commissions be addressing? And we'll start with, we'll go Paul Zummo first and work our way up.
All right. Well, this is an interesting question for me, especially considering coming from the public power world. And it probably just behooves me just to take a second and talk about our business model. I mean, our utilities are generally not regulated by state commissions. There are a handful of states where there's an exception. Usually we're regulated and we're overseen by either a municipal, an independent governing board that determines rates and other issues.
And to remind people, Paul is with the American Public Power Association.
Yeah.
It represents how many municipalities?
Well, there's over 2,000 publicly owned electric.
Okay.
And then there's some joint action agencies included in that, but there's about 1,950 retail. Most of them serve local communities, local cities, maybe the suburbs. There's a few that serve county-wise, the public utility districts, and a couple of even statewide. But again, they're governed by utility. Larger ones tend to be governed by utility boards, smaller ones by city councils. But in terms of public power, coming in from that perspective, you know, there's a even though utilities are independent, they're not. It's not like the fire department. They're independent entities yet, especially since most of them are small. The median size of a public power utility is 2,000 customers. So you're talking about communities of 5,000 people or less. So they're intimately tied to the community. So I think here the question is maybe slightly different than it might be for IOUs and cooperatives, and I can respond from them. But I think the government has a responsibility as at least as a backstop. You know, I think I actually just happened to see a question came through maybe anticipating it. I think it's up to the utilities themselves and the people to set the rates. And in terms of the equity issues, I don't think we should be agnostic to them. I don't think we should disregard those issues at all. And certainly in public power land, we can't be. But if you've got a rate that works for most customers, or you think will work for most customers, then it's up to the government to act to enact programs, to enact LIHEAP kind of programs or customer support programs. So I think when it comes to equity, at least in the rates world, I think their role again is more of as a backstop, providing support for the customers who either are low income or not mobile, can't really adjust their usage, or not going to be able to, if there is time use rates, to change their behavior because they have medical devices in their homes. So I think that's where government comes in as sort of that backstop to that.
Okay, I'm going to jump around a bit. Mark, what's the position of RAP, or what's your position?
Well, sometimes RAP doesn't have a position. Sometimes we just argue endlessly, just like this call. So, you know, I absolutely think that low-income customers should qualify for bill discounts. I know not all states do that. You know, there is an argument that all should be handled through the tax code. That's something that there are law school classes that debate that sort of thing. But, you know, as a practical matter, this is a way that you can help people in the real world, and you can go ahead and do that without overly burdening the rest of your customer base. You know, it's such a broad issue. I think, you know, for emergency needs, you know, if people want to make investments, the key thing is to charge them fair prices for the services and products they're getting from the grid. And, you know, and you pay them a fair avoided cost for what they are providing to the system. So, you know, in the rate design context, I think that's really the key. If people want to make emergency backup investments, that's fine. No, I actually believe that net metering needs to be reformed going forward. You know, the simple volumetric monthly netting is not the future of and can't be the future of this industry. You know, at a very low level, it doesn't impact anybody, but once you hit 5 or 10%, you start talking about real money. So it's important to have a fair framework going forward. I'm actually not a big fan of grandfathering for long periods of time. You know, look, I plan on doing this for the next 30 years. So if you grandfather a new set of customers every 3 years, by the time I retire, there will be 10 different sets of customers on 10 separate programs and 10 separate different kinds
Yeah.
of rates. And the level of complexity starts to get too high. So you're going to have fair transitions over time is the key thing. So
Ahmad, how about you?
So my solution is very simple. Equity is a social justice issue. It's a societal issue. It's an issue for governments and legislatures. It is not an issue for utility commissions. It's not an issue for rate design. Suppose we look at a low-income customer example. Large family, large house, poorly insulated, not enough income to support putting food on the table. That should be more priorities to get food on the table in that house, help them to pay their rent, help them for clothing and shelter and education. Electricity is a part of it, yes, so give them an income subsidy, but don't, I mean, like California has this program called CARE, which I'm sure several of you are familiar with. It's a 20 to 30% discount on your bill from the electric utilities. It's required by law, and all the other customers pay for that. And it runs into the billions of dollars, not millions, but billions. And it's rising and rising and rising, especially with tiered rates, it becomes massive.
Yeah.
So the best way to deal with it is have the income tax code go into helping the low income customers, or provide some kind of, you know, the second best solution is an energy voucher, like an energy stamp. So provide the energy stamp, but the question is who will pay for the energy stamp? If it's the other customer, then you're back to the equity issue. That's one example. The other example is the solar issue, the net metering issue. I'll just make one comment on that, which is typically the customers putting in solar are very well-off customers who can afford to do that. And so, by the way, there's a comment that just came in from PG&E. CARE is actually 35% discount in California by statute. So it's even higher than I had realized. And I have seen people on Social Security who are otherwise well off, but on Social Security, getting all their appliances changed out through the CARE program. I mean, it is incredible what people are doing to exploit the incentives. It's being misused and it's being abused. In any event, income tax code is the way to do it. And for solar, yes, I actually agree with Mark on that issue, that some solution is needed, but try talking to the solar industry and try talking to the solar customers. And if you are still standing on two legs, hats off to you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems is nowadays we have so many people, like 40% of the people can't pay the utility bills.
Right.
And in a lot of states, like in my state, they're ordered not to turn people off. So what's going to happen with that? And another problem, having been in politics and regulation my whole life, is politicians would much rather put those costs into the utility bills because they don't get the flack for that as much as they do if they were to raise a tax or create a new tax. That's been demonstrated in New Jersey decade after decade. And I think that's a political issue that unfortunately a lot of legislators have decided utility commissioners can handle that. They got a term longer than mine.
And you're basically saying what I've heard from the commission in Alberta, I heard from the commissions in every state, including California, that don't expect the legislature to take it up. And so it's a question of kick the can down the road and let
Correct.
the other person at the other end. So again, you know, I have to leave, unfortunately, as you know, because I need to take a break.
Right.
But what I was going to say is, I was asked in one rate case in Georgia whether rate design was as much art as it was science. Somebody had put up a paper by my friend Jim Lazar, which
Yeah.
talked about how bad demand charges were. And I was asked to make a comment on the paper. I said, we have a difference of opinion. So he said, okay, so it's as much art as it is science. I said, to be perfectly blunt, it is mostly politics.
Yes. Well, thank you for joining us. Everybody else will stay on, but we'll see you again
Absolutely.
sometime.
I will follow up if there are questions that
The
come
people have
along
for
that
you
I
will
can-
get to the questions, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I enjoyed it very
Excellent.
much, and I apologize for having to leave early.
That's okay, take care.
Bye.
Okay, on the same question, Bryan Hannegan, followed by Cyndee, followed by Paul Nelson.
Thanks, Jeanne.
Quickly too, because I want to get to the last question too.
Yeah. Our conversation about equity at Holy Cross, I mean, we've had an extensive conversation with our board over the last several months. This is a big issue for them. Focuses on 3 areas. 1, low income, not only the affordability and the energy burden question, but also the access to upfront finance. Most of them can't pay for weatherization. Most of them can't pay for battery storage. So it's an inadvertent barrier to them making investments in things that would ultimately ease their energy burden later on down the road. The second, we've talked about it already, DER owners versus non-DER owners. How do you allocate fair share of network costs and benefits across all of those? Hot topic elsewhere. We can go into that in its own webinar. And then the third, which is super important for us, given our population, diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly the Spanish-speaking population
Yes.
that lives in our Fair Valleys. How do we make sure that all of our materials are translated, that all of our programs are accessible, that when they call us, they get somebody that can speak to them as well as a native English speaker would to an English participant? I know that Cyndee's probably got similar challenges in her service territory as well. So that's a super important one that we shouldn't forget.
Okay, and then who we got left? Cyndee, and then Mark, and then we're not going to, and then Bryan. We're not going to get, that was Bryan. So just Cyndee and then Paul Nelson. And then we're going to go right to the Q&As because we have a lot of good questions. We'll ignore the obligations of the utility, which we all know is to serve the public. Anyway, go ahead.
So on this issue, the challenge is, as already discussed, that the IOUs are directed by legislature and regulators to implement various policy programs. The one thing I would say, though, is that when we look at the tools that we use to be able to address these policy directives, that we need to stop doing it through the manipulation and distortion of rates. Michael used to always tell me that, whether or not the rates are accurate or cost-based, customers will respond to it because it's appropriate that they do so. Those are the prices that they see. And so our ability to be able to enable these programs through something other than rate design is absolutely critical. And it helps avoid some of the transition issues that we have seen in a variety of cases. Specifically NEM ends up being one of the examples of that. And so the more and more that we can find those incentives to address these problems through a direct payment structure rather than the distortion of the rates, the better results we will have. And then that allows us the ability to be able to transition more effectively when those incentives are no longer needed.
Okay, and last but not least, Paul Nelson.
Yeah, I mean, so, show that I'm not unfairly beating up solar customers and EV customers, in full disclosure, I am both. I am a net energy metering customer and I have an electric vehicle. And the reason I'm bringing this up in the equity discussion is I think I paid the minimum bill from Southern California Edison at about $120, $130 for the entire year.
For your EV?
Yes, for all my electrical consumption, including the use of my electric vehicle. And I paid about $130 for electrical service last year.
So that's a tariff issue.
It comes down to the equity of bad rate design. I want to take this question beyond just addressing low income or disadvantaged communities. It's a bigger equity of somebody else is paying for my electrical service and it's not me. And I think in a line of this, especially now we have COVID, of other residential classes and small businesses, this has become even worse.
Yeah.
And I do think especially in California, there's a growing tension that's going on. What's equitable between residential and non-residential rates? If you compare non-residential rates compared to all of our neighboring states, the rates are twice as high. Now,
it comes to,
in some respects,
again,
residents can choose, but businesses can choose elsewhere to go, and that has effects. economic effects. So
And that's a politics where politics pulls into rate making, and the elected
Yes.
officials, the legislators or the governors
yes,
want to say we have 200,000 EVs. Sometimes they don't factor in or talk to the utility commissioners about what that means and the impact of others. Right,
Yeah.
it's a political issue. Okay,
Yeah.
I think we should, this is great. I think we're going to have Vic go now to the Q's and A's, of which we have 13 really good ones. So try to keep your responses, we have 23 minutes, try to keep your responses short. Victor, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeanne. First question, I guess, would be directed to Bryan. You're saying that you want to get to 100% renewables. How are you going to do that? How are you going to provide energy during the nighttime?
Thanks, Victor. We are drawing upon a variety of carbon-free resources, including ample sources of wind energy from the eastern plains of Colorado, which can be thought of as the western plains of Kansas. And if you like Kansas, then you like eastern Colorado. And access to the state's transmission network will be important to get those wind resources into our territory. The wind projects that are out there are producing significantly in the overnight hours. Our load shape as we look to 2030 will have peaks during the midday from solar production and peaks in the overnight with respect to wind. Our bigger challenge will be managing those peaks into the morning and into the evening hours where the peaks in consumption occur. And so for that reason, energy storage of all shapes and sizes, demand flexibility, probably using dynamic pricing, these will all be important elements of our future resource plan.
Okay, great. Here's another interesting question, and it cuts across industries. And this question is raised by somebody in the postal industry, but I'll also give you a perspective of the telecom industry. In the postal industry, the Postal Service shows that it has a net operating profit from each of its services, and yet loses a huge amount of money. In telecom, where, and let me make it very simple, there is the marginal cost of providing services is approaching zero because there's a huge amount of capacity from fiber. So the question is, when you in both cases, there seems to be a disconnect between, let's say, volumetric pricing or even marginal cost pricing and cost recovery of the network. How would you solve that problem? Now, Ahmad was talking about having a demand or some sort of fixed charge for the network. Any comments on that type of issue?
Well, so when you're talking about many different products, it gets complicated because market definition and product definition and how prices are formed are pretty idiosyncratic. You know, with electricity prices and regulated electricity prices, you know, one of the key things that you worry about is information asymmetry, and you don't actually know what the utilities costs are. You know, they put forward a bunch of spreadsheets and a bunch of stacks of papers with some numbers on it. And the question is, how do you effectively regulate and decide what's, you know, you say prudent, imprudent, but one of the ways that the market normally deals with this, it is somebody's going to pad their costs and they put it into prices, then they're going to have lower consumption, right? So that's normally the market test for padding your costs. So you know, with electricity, you want to look at nearby competitors' markets, and I think that is an important principle that we want competition, and we want customer response to discipline the cost structures of the utilities.
Well, the point I guess I'm trying to get at is, let's say the cable companies and the traditional telephone companies are highly competitive because they have to recover fixed costs. They have marginal costs of capacity that's close to zero, but yet both of them have, let's say, rates in the $50 to $75 range to recover the network. So how do you translate that into the electric utility space?
Well, so I don't mind deregulation in general if there's actually competition in the market.
Yeah, I understand, but there's that's a fixed price.
Well, I mean, oil refineries are massive fixed capital investments, and they sell their gas $1 at a gallon at a time. So the way that my point is that the product definition and the price, with the way the price is set, is not necessarily linked to the capital investment structure.
Okay. Any other comments on that about the parallel between the postal service, the telecom industry, and electric utility pricing?
Well, what I would add is that when you think about the rates that the utilities offer, those rates serve two purposes. So one is that they are designed to recover costs. So recover costs that are approved by their various commissions. And so that's one purpose of the rates and the rate design is to recover those costs. And then an additional purpose is trying to provide prices that incent customers to do a variety of things, right? Help to incent certain customer behaviors, and a lot of that ends up being guided by policy directives. So there are those two components to that, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, and also note that the costs that get recovered from those rates are approved by the respective commissions.
Any other comments, or otherwise I'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, well, next one is tariffs for local microgrids. That's the new frontier in the network. What kind of tariff structures do you think would be optimal for integrating microgrids into the backbone grid? Anybody?
Well, I'm happy to respond. I mean, I might get, well, if you're about to say I might get in trouble for what I'm about to say, you should probably just stop. But microgrids I think are a tricky topic because, if the broader grid fails, who owns the resources on the microgrid? Are they if it's not the utility, are other customers? What responsibilities do they have to provide power to the other customers on the microgrid? You're recreating all of the pricing and regulation problems of an investor-owned utility, but on a smaller scale. And it's very rare, and it's only going to be triggered a few times a year at most, in most cases. So that's one of those things. Like if you're in someplace that has recurring storms and recurring large-scale outages, you want to take there's plenty of resiliency and backup power and storage and different things you can do. The concept of tariffs for microgrids, maybe it just goes over my head.
Anybody else? Or
we've taken on this question quite a bit after the fires in our area in 2018 and 2020, and I want to just encourage the panelists and the attendees to think of microgrids as having both black sky value, those few hours of the year where it's absolutely the only thing that's keeping you in place. But also microgrids can have, if they're properly designed and integrated into the grid, what we call blue sky value.
Yes.
And what we look for when we're sitting down with our communities and developing microgrid projects and proposals is a way in which the utility can be involved in the design and the operation of that microgrid in a way that allows us to pay for that blue sky value and help finance those extra costs of the microgrid that are necessarily greater than what you would get from plain old grid supply. We've got a couple of different projects going on in our community right now. financing, incentives, dynamic rates. There's a variety of tools that we can put at it, but I don't think we're going to find the perfect one-size-fits-all microgrid tariff. More than likely, it's going to be a bespoke set of agreements, not unlike a PPA for a certain set of grid services.
Brian, is anybody else doing that? Do you know? Because it sounds like a
Yes,
smart thing to
there's
do.
a cooperative, Poudre Valley Electric Association outside Fort Collins that is doing something very similar in an area affected by wildfires to the west in the foothills of the Rockies. And there are plenty of others. North Carolina Electric Membership Cooperative, the G&T there, has partnered with its distribution cooperatives to co-own and invest with the DISCO and also with the local owner, microgrids involving hog farms and all sorts of crazy things. So yeah, there's a lot of
Cyndee,
creativity.
do you know if there are any utilities? Let me know if any utilities are doing it that are money-making, shareholder owning utilities that are doing it?
I don't know. I'd have to defer to Cyndee on that in the California experience. I know of microgrids involving CCAs and utility providers in California, which is my home state, full disclosure. But I don't know of them elsewhere.
Okay. Any guys who know Cyndee or anybody who knows utilities? No? That's an area that we should think about. Utilities should think about. Okay, keep going, Victor.
Okay, here's another one, and this one is more of a political economy one. Why is the incumbent required to solve social issues? Okay.
Hey, Mark, why don't you start with that?
Look, you can't take the politics out of the politics is really the thing. That every single market has its politics. It has people who are jostling for their advantage. If you talk to solar customers about getting rid of net metering, they get worried. You say, oh, utilities, by the way, your return of equity isn't 10%, it's actually 8.5. It's a crisis, right? There's everyone has their set of concerns in this regulated space, and
I would think based on my entire career, it's because they are a monopoly. They are the ones that are providing service to those customers, even though allegedly there's choice in most states. Texas is about being the only one that really does choice, I think. So I really think it's because there's a monopoly. People know that they've been around forever. And they are, in fact, the number one priority is they are to provide public service and make money for their shareholders. So
Yeah.
I think it's just not just a corporation who's making money. They're a corporation given a license by the state to make money by serving everyone.
Well, I guess the issue is that if microgrids proliferate and DER behind the meter, is the utility, has the obligation changed? So let's go back to microgrids. Suppose that there's a microgrid and one of the members of the microgrid either leaves the microgrid or goes bankrupt. And let's say the microgrid doesn't have enough funding anymore. Does the electric utility have to have backup capacity to make sure that everybody has power? And if that's the case, who pays for that?
And they are the provider of last resort. That's why the question we didn't get to was, is a new business case necessary for the survival of utilities? I think the answer from everybody would be yes. The question is, what would that be?
Jeanne, let me differ with that a little bit. I will say yes, but it's probably not a replacement for the existing business case. It's probably and not or. And I want to make a comment that I wanted to make earlier, which is a lot of our success with rate design is going to be to give consumers what they want before somebody else does.
Yes.
We want to give them a variety of options to engage. Victor, to your question about the microgrid, if the microgrid operator or the community has said, screw you guys, we don't need you, we're going to do just fine, and there's no contractual relationship, they've grid defected in the RMI parlance. If they come back to us later, we'll be happy to serve them, but it's a new agreement. Of course we'll agree to serve you, but it's a new agreement. We don't have to step in every time somebody goes bankrupt unless there's part of the deal where we've agreed to do that. On the question of social, I do want to say that for cooperatives, concern for community is one of our 7 cooperative principles. And because we are owned and operated by those that we serve, when our community stands up and says, we'd like you to do something for the low income, we'd like you to do something for those without equitable access, they're our owners, so we do it. And I think in the municipal context, the political leadership feels much the same way. So that would be one of the reasons why, yes, we're going to do it.
Yeah, Bryan, when I was in the telecom industry, I used to set rates for a lot of co-ops, and the mindset is very different. It's you want to recover costs, but it isn't that maximizing the value of the firm. There's a strong community interest there that they want to serve, even if we don't maximize profits. And it's a different mindset that's hard to get across to the rest of the industry.
Okay, next question.
Okay, well, let's.
Paul, I think Paul wanted to jump in there.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, on the provider of last resort, I mean, this doesn't come down to the distribution and transmission, the delivery function. It really comes down to the acquisition of generation costs. And I think the big issue is if there's a provider of last resort, what is the requirement for them to plan that they may have a bunch of customers unexpectedly come back to them? And are they required to plan for that possibility, incur costs for that possibility? And of course, then now the big question is, who pays for that? Because it could have, if it happens very quickly in large numbers, you could have a significant increase in the cost to go out and get additional generation service for those customers that have now defaulted back to the provider.
Right. And I know in a state like New Jersey, where we did all the stuff that we did, they got to take them back, residential. They got to take them back. And that's the utility's problem. If it's a huge take back, it could be a huge problem for the utility. But that's the way it is now, I think, in almost all states, isn't it? Okay. Go ahead. Another question.
I think I got to most of. Let's see if there are any new ones. Well, one question is, why do we focus mainly on uniform pricing? In a competitive market, there's a wide variety of prices, menus of prices. Is there something that the electric utility industry is missing? Any comments?
So there's, getting more locational prices. You absolutely can try to do that. I mean, we have, you have zones, LMPs are often zonal in some ISOs, right? And you can try to reflect things like that. Circuit by circuit, you can doing transformer by transformer. The number of transformers gets prohibitively large at some point. So you have to balance administrative costs with the expected system cost savings. So and then the tradition of postage stamp pricing is also partly political, but also reflects antipathy to price discrimination. That you want everyone to be given have equal footing in some sense, and you can imagine the controversies get really bad if one town center has higher rates than the next town center over. I mean, we have this all the time in the lines between investor-owned utilities, but people are used to that, so that they don't worry about it. But when you create new divisions, why is my town center twice as expensive as the town next door? It gets complicated.
Unless they have better service. Paul?
I mean, a lot of what I hear of comparisons of the regulated rate structure, tariff structure, and entities that may be similar with such to competition, and well, why don't you do this, and why are you off in the uniform? Well, there's a big difference between the regulated utility that generally has to accept all comers who want to take service on that tariff.
Yes.
But in a competitive environment where they're free to set their rates, and they all of a sudden discover, the price that we were charging is no longer working, what do? They immediately stop offering that rate to customers and change it quickly. And that's something that the regulated business can't do, is quickly deny and change those rates because they have to get approval.
Okay. We have 3 minutes left. Does anybody have any last words or a last thought that want to leave with people?
Well, Jeanne, maybe I'll do that.
Okay, why don't you do
Couple
that?
of minutes. I want to thank the panelists and the moderator. This has been a wonderful discussion. It was very lively, very insightful, and it highlights a lot of the issues, some of which have been long-standing, but nevertheless need to work on them. And it suggests to me that perhaps we do need a follow-up pricing panel to we'll collect again and think about it and see what are the critical issues associated that we haven't quite covered. Anyway, thanks to everybody, and I appreciate your participation, and look forward to working with you in future webinars. So
Yes, we thank our Zen masters today who understand rate design, and there are different ways of looking at it. But
Yes.
thank you, were great. Thank you so much.
all right.
Jeanne, for some reason, I'm
Thank you,
more
everybody.
wound up now than I was at the beginning. So I don't know if there was any.
Oh, there's an old saying. There is an old saying that I think it was in a Hermann Hesse novel. He said, "Nothing dulls the mind as much as too much knowledge."
Yes. So now you should all take a half an hour to meditate on what we were just through.
Okay, take care,
Take
everybody.
care. Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Great to
Bye.
see you.